You watch as competitors who play dirty get ahead while your ethical approach keeps you struggling for recognition. Every day you follow the rules and treat people fairly, yet somehow those willing to bend principles seem to effortlessly climb higher while you remain stuck in the same position, wondering if being a good person means accepting mediocrity forever. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, and I spent my life studying power in the most ruthless political arena in history, Renaissance. Italy, where kingdoms fell overnight and leaders who hesitated lost everything. What I discovered about strategic ruthlessness will transform how you navigate any competitive environment, showing you exactly when and how to abandon pleasantries and deploy calculated force to achieve your goals. The battlefield may have changed from Italian city-states to modern boardrooms, but the principles of power and strategic ruthlessness remain as essential today as they were 5 centuries ago. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Machiavellian wisdom and comment. Below where you're watching from, I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of necessary ruthlessness. I was once like you, believing that competence and loyalty would be rewarded, that doing the right thing would ultimately lead to success. For 14 years, I served the Florentine Republic with unwavering dedication, rising through the ranks of government to become second chancellor. I negotiated with kings, organized armies, and helped maintain the delicate balance that kept Florence independent in a world where larger powers constantly threatened to devour us. I believed in the system. I believed that merit mattered more than politics, that honest service would be recognized and rewarded. I was wrong, and my naivety nearly destroyed me. The letter arrived on a cold November morning in 1512. The Medici family had returned to power after 18 years of exile, and with a single document, my entire world collapsed. Niccolò Machiavelli is hereby dismissed from all positions and banned from entering the Palazzo della Signoria. 14 years of faithful service erased with ink on parchment, but dismissal was only the beginning of my education in the true nature of power. Within months, I was arrested on charges of conspiracy against the new regime. They accused me of plotting with Republicans to overthrow Medici rule, a charge that was both false and irrelevant. The truth didn't matter. Perception and political necessity did. I remember the rope around my wrists as they hoisted me up, then let me drop, the searing pain shooting through my shoulders and arms. This was the strappato, a torture designed not just to extract confessions, but to break the spirit of those who dared to challenge authority. With each drop, each violent jolt, I understood something fundamental. Power respects only power, and those who refuse to use it will always be at the mercy of those who do. During those dark hours in the dungeon, suspended between agony and unconsciousness, I realized that all my years of believing in fairness and merit had been a comfortable delusion. The Medici didn't torture me because I was guilty. They tortured me because they could, because it sent a message to others who might consider opposing them, and because mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford when establishing dominance. But here's what transformed my suffering into wisdom. I began to see that the leaders I had served, the ones I had considered just and noble, were themselves practitioners of calculated ruthlessness. They had simply hidden it better. Lorenzo de' Medici, whom history calls the Magnificent, hadn't earned that title through kindness. He had systematically eliminated rivals, manipulated allies, and used both carrot and stick to maintain power for decades. The difference was that he understood something I was only beginning to grasp. Successful leaders don't choose between being good and being effective. They choose when to appear good and when effectiveness demands the appearance of severity. They understand that the greatest cruelty is often the failure to act decisively when action could prevent greater suffering. My imprisonment ended with a general amnesty, but my real education was just beginning. Exiled to my small farm outside Florence, I had time to think, to observe, and to study the patterns of power that had eluded me for so long. I began to see that every successful leader I had known possessed a quality that the unsuccessful ones lacked: the willingness to make difficult decisions that preserved their ability to do good overall. This was my renaissance, not a return to classical learning, but a rebirth of understanding about human nature and the mechanics of power. I realized that the choice wasn't between being moral and being effective, but between being effectively moral and being uselessly pure. During my years of exile and reflection, I developed what would become my most famous metaphor, born from watching both the rise and fall of powerful men. A prince, I wrote, must learn to be both a lion and a fox, for the lion cannot protect himself from snares, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. This wasn't mere poetic flourish. It was the distillation of everything I had observed about why some leaders thrive while others, equally intelligent and well-intentioned, find themselves destroyed by circumstances they should have anticipated. The lion represents the direct application of force, raw power, intimidation, the ability to crush opposition through superior strength. When I served in government, I watched our military commanders who understood this principle. They knew that sometimes the mere display of overwhelming force prevents the need for actual violence. A general who positions his cannons where enemies can see them often wins battles without firing a shot. But I also watched leaders who relied solely on the lion's approach, and I saw how predictably they failed. They were the ones who met every challenge with escalation, who believed that greater force was always the answer to resistance. Like actual lions, they were magnificent in direct confrontation but helpless when faced with traps, deceived by cunning or undermined by patient enemies who refused to meet them in open battle. The fox, by contrast, represents strategic cunning, the ability to recognize traps, to mislead enemies, to win through intelligence rather than strength. During my diplomatic missions, I encountered masters of this approach. They were the negotiators, who could convince you that black was white, who could extract concessions by making you believe you were getting the better deal. But I also saw the limitations of pure fox behavior. These clever manipulators often found themselves cornered by those willing to use direct force. They could outmaneuver and outsmart opponents in complex negotiations, but when faced with someone willing to simply take what they wanted through superior power, their elaborate schemes crumbled. The genius lies in knowing which animal to embody in each situation. When Cesare Borgia wanted to pacify the Romagna, he began as a fox, carefully building alliances, making promises, appearing reasonable and diplomatic. But when subtlety failed to achieve complete compliance, he revealed the lion within. His sudden, overwhelming displays of force weren't random brutality. They were calculated demonstrations that made future negotiations unnecessary. Most people in competitive environments make the fatal error of choosing one approach and sticking with it. The naturally aggressive become predictably forceful. Everyone knows they can be provoked into rash action or worn down through persistent resistance. The naturally clever become predictably subtle. Opponents learn to look for their schemes and can often neutralize their advantage through direct action. Your colleagues who always rely on political maneuvering become known quantities. Smart. Opponents simply bypass their games with direct appeals to higher authority. Your competitors who always use aggressive tactics become vulnerable to those who know how to use their aggression against them. The truly dangerous competitor is the one whose next move you cannot predict because they have mastered both approaches. They might spend months building a relationship with a rival, appearing cooperative and supportive, only to strike decisively when that rival becomes a real threat. Alternatively, they might use an immediate display of capability to establish respect, then shift to collaborative approaches once their strength is acknowledged. In modern environments, the lion might be the willingness to directly confront poor performance, to take credit for your contributions, or to clearly state your terms in negotiations. The fox might be building alliances before you need them, gathering information about opponents' weaknesses, or positioning yourself so that others' failures create opportunities for your advancement. The key is recognizing which approach each situation demands and having the flexibility to shift between them without warning. Your reputation should be that you are capable of both and that others cannot predict which version of you they will encounter. This uncertainty itself becomes a form of power, as people who cannot predict your responses cannot effectively plan against you. Let me tell you about the most counterintuitive lesson I learned about leadership. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is appear cruel, and the cruelest thing you can do is appear kind. I discovered this principle while studying the fall of Piero Soderini, the man who had been my patron in the Florentine Republic. Soderini was genuinely good-hearted, genuinely concerned with justice and fairness. He believed that leading through example and persuasion would eventually win over his opponents. He was wrong, and his goodness destroyed not only himself but everyone who served under him, including me. Soderini's fatal flaw was his inability to recognize that mercy shown to enemies is often cruelty inflicted on allies. While he spent years trying to accommodate and convert his opponents, those same opponents were systematically undermining his authority and planning his destruction. His reluctance to use decisive force against clear threats meant that when the Medici finally struck, they faced no effective resistance. The Republic collapsed not because Soderini lacked power, but because he lacked the will to use it when necessary. I watched good people lose everything because their leader couldn't bring himself to be appropriately harsh with those who threatened their collective welfare. This taught me a mathematical truth about leadership. A small amount of strategic severity can prevent enormous amounts of suffering. When Cesare Borgia conquered the Romagna, he understood this calculation perfectly. The region had been plagued for years by petty tyrants who terrorized the population through random violence and arbitrary cruelty. Borgia could have tried to gradually reform these rulers, to negotiate better behavior, to appeal to their better nature. Instead, he had them killed or exiled, quickly and efficiently. The immediate result appeared harsh. Several rulers lost their positions and their lives. But the longer-term result was that the region enjoyed peace and prosperity for the first time in decades. By being decisively cruel to a few, Borgia was kind to thousands. His calculated harshness prevented years of continued suffering under ineffective leadership. Most people never learn to make this distinction between productive and counterproductive severity. They either avoid all conflict, which allows problems to fester and multiply, or they become arbitrarily harsh, which destroys morale and creates unnecessary enemies. Calculated cruelty has specific characteristics that distinguish it from mere brutality. First, it is targeted, directed precisely at those whose continued resistance or poor performance threatens the welfare of the larger group. Second, it is decisive, swift and complete enough to resolve the problem, rather than merely irritating the opposition. Third, it is educational, designed to send a clear message about consequences while establishing predictable standards for future behavior. When you avoid necessary, difficult conversations with underperforming team members, you are being cruel to the high performers who must compensate for their deficiencies. When you fail to confront a colleague who takes credit for others' work, you are being cruel to those whose contributions are being stolen. When you allow toxic behavior to continue because confrontation feels uncomfortable, you are being cruel to everyone who must endure that toxicity. The most successful leaders I have observed understand that their primary obligation is to the collective welfare, not to the comfort of individuals who threaten that welfare. They deliver difficult messages, clearly and directly. They remove people who cannot or will not meet necessary standards. They make decisions that may hurt individuals but protect the integrity and effectiveness of the whole. This doesn't mean becoming a tyrant or enjoying others' suffering. It means developing the emotional strength to do what serves the greater good, even when it feels personally uncomfortable. It means recognizing that leadership often requires you to be the person willing to make hard choices so that others don't have to live with the consequences of avoiding them. The cruelest leaders are often those who appear kindest in the moment, who avoid difficult decisions, who prioritize being liked over being effective, who sacrifice long-term welfare for short-term comfort. Their desire to avoid appearing harsh often results in allowing situations to deteriorate until much harsher measures become necessary. True strategic thinking requires you to sometimes appear severe in order to prevent genuine cruelty. It requires you to accept responsibility for difficult decisions so that others can benefit from decisive leadership. It requires you to be willing to be misunderstood by those who cannot see the larger calculations behind your choices. Of all the leaders I observed during my career, none taught me more about the practical application of power than Cesare Borgia, Duke of Valentinois. Most people remember him as a villain, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, who carved out a kingdom through violence and treachery. But I saw him as the most instructive example of how strategic ruthlessness, properly applied, could create stability and prosperity where chaos had previously reigned. I first encountered Borgia during my diplomatic missions between 1502 and 1503, when Florence was trying to navigate the dangerous waters of Italian politics. What struck me immediately was not his cruelty — there were plenty of cruel rulers in Renaissance Italy — but his systematic approach to power. Where other leaders reacted to events, Borgia created them. Where others hoped for favorable circumstances, Borgia manufactured them. His conquest of the Romagna region was a master class in strategic planning, rather than simply invading with overwhelming force which would have created unified resistance and long-term rebellion. Borgia carefully studied each city's internal dynamics. He identified local factions that could be turned against the ruling powers, promised them benefits under his rule, and used their assistance to minimize his military expenditure while maximizing his political advantage. But what made Borgia truly exceptional was his understanding of the psychology of elimination. He knew that simply defeating enemies wasn't enough. They had to be removed so completely that they could never again threaten his position. When he conquered a territory, he didn't just exile the former rulers, he systematically eliminated their supporters, their potential successors, and anyone who might serve as a rallying point for future opposition. The most brilliant example of this approach was his handling of the conspiracy at Senigallia. Several of his former allies had turned against him, believing they could use his own methods against him, rather than confront them directly, which would have been costly and uncertain. Borgia pretended to reconcile with them. He invited them to a meeting, claiming he wanted to restore their alliance and plan future campaigns together. The conspirators arrived expecting to negotiate from a position of strength, perhaps even to dictate terms to Borgia. Instead, they found themselves surrounded and captured within hours. By dawn, the leaders of the conspiracy were dead, their armies were leaderless, and their territories had fallen under Borgia's control without a single battle. What impressed me most about this operation was its surgical precision. Borgia didn't engage in random violence or widespread reprisals. He eliminated exactly those people who posed specific threats to his authority, and he did it in a way that demonstrated his capability to anyone else who might consider opposition. The message was clear. Betrayal would be met with swift and complete destruction, but loyalty would be rewarded and protected. Borgia also understood the importance of appearing legitimate while acting decisively. He secured papal backing for his campaigns, framing his conquests as necessary for regional stability and church interests. He established effective administrative systems in conquered territories, improving trade and reducing the random violence that had plagued these regions under previous rulers. His subjects often found themselves better governed under his rule than they had been under their former leaders. But I also learned from Borgia's eventual downfall, which taught me equally valuable lessons about the limits of even the most skillful ruthlessness. His fatal flaw was his dependence on his father's papal power. When Alexander VI died suddenly in 1503, Borgia found himself without his primary source of legitimacy and resources. Worse, the new pope, Julius II, was Borgia's personal enemy and immediately moved to strip him of his territories. This taught me that no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome strategic dependence on factors beyond your control. Borgia had been so focused on expanding his power through his father's position that he had failed to build independent sources of strength. When his external support vanished, his internal position collapsed despite all his previous successes. The lesson for modern competitors is clear. Build your own foundation of power, rather than depending entirely on a patron, a company, or a single relationship. Borgia's methods of systematic planning, precise elimination of threats, and strategic deception remain as effective today as they were 5 centuries ago. But his failure reminds us that sustainable success requires independence from any single source of authority or support. Study how Borgia identified the specific individuals who threatened his goals, how he turned their own alliances against them, and how he created conditions where eliminating them appeared both necessary and justified. But also study how his dependence on external validation ultimately destroyed everything he had built, and ensure that your own power base is diversified enough to survive the loss of any single element. The difference between successful ruthlessness and destructive aggression often comes down to a single factor: timing. I learned this lesson painfully through observing leaders who possessed all the right instincts but destroyed themselves by acting too early or too late. During my diplomatics career, I watched the Duke of Urbino make a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable but was fatal in its timing. He chose to resist Cesare Borgia's expansion just as Borgia was reaching the peak of his power and papal support. Had the Duke acted a year earlier, when Borgia's position was less secure, or waited until the papal situation became unstable, he might have succeeded. Instead, he challenged Borgia at the moment when Borgia was strongest and most capable of decisive response. The Duke lost everything: his territory, his titles, and ultimately his life. The cruel irony was that the Duke's assessment of Borgia as a threat was completely accurate. His strategic thinking was sound. His only error was in timing, but that single error made all his other calculations irrelevant. Most people who fail at strategic ruthlessness don't fail because they lack the will to act. They fail because they cannot read the optimal moment for action. They either strike too early when they lack sufficient power or justification, or too late when their opponents have grown too strong or circumstances have shifted against them. Learning to read these moments requires developing sensitivity to several key indicators. First, you must recognize when your relative power is peaking compared to your opposition. This isn't just about your absolute strength, but about the gap between your capabilities and theirs. Sometimes you should act when you're still building power, if you can see that your opponents are building it faster. Second, you must identify windows of vulnerability in your opponents, moments when they are distracted, overextended, or facing other pressures that limit their ability to respond effectively. Borgia was masterful at this, often timing his moves to coincide with his enemy's weakest moments or when they were committed to other conflicts. Third, you must recognize when circumstances are creating justification for your actions. The most effective strategic moves appear inevitable in retrospect, as if they were the only reasonable response to existing conditions. This requires patience, waiting for situations to develop that make your necessary actions appear not only justified but overdue. I observed this principle during the rise of the Medici. They didn't simply seize power through force. They waited for the Republic to demonstrate its own ineffectiveness through a series of military defeats and economic problems. By the time they acted, many Florentines were ready to welcome them. As a solution to existing chaos rather than resist them, as conquerors. The most common timing error I see is acting in anger or frustration, rather than from strategic calculation. When someone offends or threatens you, the natural impulse is to respond immediately, to prove that you cannot be pushed around. But immediate responses are almost always suboptimal responses. They reveal your capabilities too early, they allow opponents to prepare countermoves, and they often lack the careful preparation that makes decisive action truly effective. Better to appear to accept temporary disadvantage while you prepare a response that will be both more devastating and more difficult to counter. Let your opponents believe they have successfully challenged you while you arrange circumstances that will make their victory short-lived. Another critical aspect of timing involves recognizing when not to act. There are moments when any action, no matter how well planned, will fail because circumstances are not favorable. During these periods, the wise strategy is to preserve your resources, gather intelligence, and position yourself for future opportunities. I learned this during my own fall from power. I could see the Medici return approaching, but I lacked the position or resources to prevent it. My mistake was in continuing to act as if I could influence events rather than adapting to preserve what influence I could for the future. Sometimes, the most strategic choice is strategic withdrawal. The key to mastering timing is developing patience paired with constant vigilance. You must be willing to wait for optimal conditions while remaining alert to recognize them when they arrive. You must resist premature action while staying prepared to move decisively when the moment is right. This requires emotional discipline. The desire for immediate satisfaction, for quick resolution of conflicts, for prompt vindication, these natural impulses are the enemy of strategic timing. The leader who masters timing often appears passive or indecisive to observers who cannot see the larger game being played. The question that haunted me throughout my political career, and which I posed most famously in The Prince, was this: is it better to be loved or feared? After decades of observation and painful personal experience, I reached a conclusion that most people find uncomfortable, but which remains as true today as it was in Renaissance Italy. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But this answer requires careful explanation, because most people misunderstand what I mean by both fear and love in the context of leadership and competitive relationships. When I speak of love in political relationships, I'm not referring to genuine affection, but to the conditional approval that people give to leaders who make them feel comfortable and secure. This kind of love is entirely self-interested. It lasts only as long as the leader continues to provide benefits without requiring significant sacrifices. The moment a beloved leader must make unpopular decisions or ask for difficult commitments, this love evaporates. I witnessed this phenomenon repeatedly during my career. Leaders who were genuinely popular, who seemed to enjoy unwavering support from their followers, found themselves abandoned the moment circumstances required them to act against their supporters' immediate preferences. The love that people feel for leaders who never challenge them is shallow and unreliable. It disappears precisely when leaders most need support. Fear, properly understood, is different. It is not terror or hatred, but respect for your capability and willingness to act decisively when necessary. People who fear you in this sense don't necessarily dislike you. They simply understand that crossing you will have predictable and unpleasant consequences. This understanding shapes their behavior in ways that mere affection cannot. During my diplomatic missions, I observed that the most effective leaders commanded what I came to think of as respectful fear. Their subordinates and rivals knew exactly what standards of behavior were expected and what would happen if those standards were not met. This clarity eliminated most conflict before it began, because people understood the cost of opposition and generally chose cooperation instead. But here is the crucial distinction. Effective fear must be based on demonstrated capability, not on arbitrary cruelty or unpredictable anger. The leader who inspires productive fear is one who acts decisively when necessary, but who is otherwise fair and consistent. People know that as long as they meet clear expectations, they will be treated well, but they also know that violations will be addressed swiftly and definitively. I learned this by studying the difference between successful and unsuccessful tyrants. The unsuccessful ones relied on random violence and intimidation, creating an atmosphere where everyone felt constantly threatened regardless of their behavior. This approach ultimately turned everyone into potential enemies because people who feel threatened without cause have nothing to lose by rebellion. The successful ones, by contrast, were predictably severe with specific violations while being generous with those who met their standards. Cesare Borgia exemplified this approach. His subjects knew that betrayal or incompetence would be punished harshly, but they also knew that loyalty and effectiveness would be rewarded. This created an environment where most people chose cooperation because the benefits of compliance clearly outweighed the risks of opposition. The ideal situation, of course, is to be both feared and loved, to inspire both respect for your capabilities and genuine appreciation for your leadership. But this combination is difficult to achieve and maintain, particularly during periods of crisis or competition when difficult decisions become necessary. When forced to choose between the two, fear is more reliable because it doesn't depend on your ability to continuously satisfy others' desires. Love requires you to keep making people happy, which may conflict with making necessary but unpopular decisions. Fear only requires you to demonstrate that you will act decisively when your standards are violated, which is entirely under your control. In modern competitive environments, this translates to building a reputation for competence and reliability rather than trying to be universally liked. Your colleagues and competitors should know that you will respond effectively to attempts to undermine or take advantage of you, but they should also know that you are fair and consistent in your dealings with those who treat you professionally. The person who tries to be loved by everyone often finds themselves respected by no one because their desire for approval makes them predictably manipulable. The person who focuses on being feared through demonstrated capability often finds that this respect eventually evolves into a form of genuine regard, the kind of appreciation that people feel for leaders who create stability and clear expectations. The key is ensuring that any fear you inspire is based on respect for your abilities rather than resentment of your character. People should understand that challenging you is unwise, not because you are cruel, but because you are effective at protecting your interests and maintaining your standards. The most dangerous moment in any competitive environment comes not from external enemies, but from those closest to your position, the rivals who seek to replace you, who compete for the same resources, recognition, or opportunities. During my years in government, I learned that managing these internal threats requires a systematic approach that most people never develop because they cannot think clearly about competition. The first principle of rival management is accurate identification. Not everyone who disagrees with you is a rival, and not everyone who competes with you is a threat. True rivals share three characteristics. They want something you have or want, they have realistic prospects of taking it, and they are actively working to undermine your position. Many people waste energy fighting competitors who don't actually threaten them while ignoring genuine threats that develop quietly and patiently. I learned this distinction during the factional struggles within the Florentine government. Some officials who openly disagreed with my policies were actually valuable allies because they forced me to strengthen my arguments and anticipate opposition. Their public criticism made me more effective, not less. But others who appeared supportive in meetings were simultaneously building alternative power structures and positioning themselves to benefit from my potential failure. The most dangerous rivals are often those who appear to be cooperating with you while working to make your success irrelevant to their advancement. They don't necessarily want you to fail. They want to succeed independent of your success, which often amounts to the same thing in competitive environments where resources and opportunities are limited. Once you have correctly identified genuine rivals, you face strategic choices about how to neutralize their threat. Direct confrontation is usually the least effective approach because it forces the conflict into the open where others can take sides, and it allows your rival to prepare defenses and countermoves. Better to use methods that either eliminate the rivalry quietly or turn the rival's own strengths against them. One of the most effective approaches I observed was what I came to call strategic redirection. Instead of blocking a rival's advancement, directly skilled operators would create opportunities that channeled their rival's ambitions in directions that removed them from direct competition. This might involve recommending them for positions that appeared prestigious but actually isolated them from key decision-making, or supporting their involvement in projects that were likely to fail or that would occupy their attention during critical periods. Cesare Borgia was masterful at this technique. When faced with potential rivals among his own commanders, he often assigned them to lead campaigns in distant territories. If they succeeded, they were far from his center of power and couldn't threaten his position. If they failed, their failure justified removing them entirely. Either outcome served his interests better than direct confrontation would have. Another powerful method is what I observed during the papal politics of my era, turning rivals against each other. When you face multiple competitors, the optimal strategy is often to encourage their mutual opposition rather than fighting each of them separately. This requires careful intelligence about their individual ambitions and careful manipulation of information and opportunities to create conflicts between them. The key is ensuring that their energy goes toward fighting each other rather than toward undermining you. Sometimes this means providing each rival with information about the other's activities. Sometimes it means creating situations where their interests naturally conflict. And sometimes it means simply staying neutral while they exhaust themselves in mutual competition. But the most sophisticated approach to rival management is absorption and conversion. Rather than destroying potential threats, the truly skilled operator finds ways to make rivals dependent on their success. This might involve creating partnerships where the rival's advancement requires your continued leadership, or developing projects where their expertise is valuable but subordinate to your strategic direction. I watched Lorenzo de' Medici employ this technique brilliantly with potential challengers to his authority. Instead of eliminating them, he created roles where their talents could be utilized for his benefit while their independent power was constrained. They became invested in his success because their own success depended on it. However, there are times when elimination becomes necessary, when rivals cannot be redirected, cannot be turned against each other, and cannot be converted into allies. In these cases, the action must be swift, complete, and appear justified by the rival's own behavior. You cannot appear to be eliminating someone simply because they compete with you. You must wait for or create circumstances where their removal appears necessary for larger organizational or strategic reasons. The most important principle in all rival management is maintaining your own reputation for fairness and competence. If you become known as someone who destroys anyone who might compete with you, you will find yourself surrounded by enemies who have nothing to lose. Better to be seen as someone who rewards cooperation and punishes only genuine threats or actual misconduct. Remember that today's rival might become tomorrow's valuable ally if circumstances change. The person competing with you for a promotion might become a crucial supporter if they fail to get that promotion, but see opportunities to advance by working with you instead of against you. Always leave room for former rivals to join your coalition if they choose cooperation over continued opposition. Perhaps no aspect of my philosophy has been more misunderstood than my views on deception in leadership. Critics paint me as an advocate for pathological lying, but this fundamentally misses the point. What I discovered through careful observation is that complete honesty in competitive environments is not a virtue. It is a luxury that effective leaders cannot always afford, and a weakness that opponents will inevitably exploit. The distinction I learned to make is between destructive deception and strategic omission. Destructive deception involves creating false realities that serve only your immediate convenience, often at the expense of long-term credibility and effectiveness. Strategic omission involves controlling the flow of information to protect legitimate interests and maintain operational advantage. During my diplomatic career, I was often privy to sensitive information about Florentine military capabilities, alliance negotiations, and internal political dynamics. Had I shared this information honestly with every foreign representative I encountered, I would not have been serving truth. I would have been betraying my responsibility to protect Florence's interests. My obligation was to my city's welfare, not to satisfying others' curiosity or appearing consistently truthful to foreign powers. This taught me that the ethical leader's primary loyalty must be to the welfare of those they serve, not to abstract principles that might compromise that welfare. When someone asks you questions that, if answered honestly, would damage your ability to protect your people or achieve necessary goals, honesty becomes a form of negligence, but strategic deception requires sophisticated judgment about when it serves larger purposes and when it merely serves selfish convenience. The test I developed was this: does withholding or modifying this information serve interests larger than my personal comfort, or am I simply avoiding accountability for my own mistakes and limitations? I watched leaders destroy themselves through both excessive honesty and excessive deception. Those who shared everything they knew often found their information used against them by competitors who had no reciprocal obligation to transparency. But those who lied reflexively found their credibility eroded to the point where even their honest statements were disbelieved. The most effective operators I observed practiced what I came to think of as selective authenticity. They were scrupulously honest about certain types of information, particularly about their capabilities, their standards, and their responses to specific behaviors. But they carefully controlled information about their strategic thinking, their weaknesses, and their future plans. Cesare Borgia exemplified this approach during his campaigns. His enemies could rely absolutely on his promises about what would happen if they surrendered or if they resisted. He was completely honest about consequences, but they could never predict his next move or understand his overall strategy because he revealed only the information that served his tactical advantage. This created a powerful combination. People trusted his word about immediate transactions, while being unable to anticipate or counter his broader intentions. His honesty about specific commitments made his strategic deceptions more effective, while his strategic deceptions protected his ability to honor his honest commitments. In modern competitive environments, this translates to being reliable about your professional commitments while being strategic about sharing your methods, your concerns, and your future plans. Your colleagues should know that you will deliver what you promise and respond predictably to specific behaviors, but they don't need to understand your complete thinking about organizational dynamics or your personal advancement strategies. The key is developing internal clarity about which information serves larger purposes when shared and which information serves larger purposes when protected. This requires honest self-examination about your motivations. Are you withholding information to serve legitimate strategic interests, or are you simply avoiding difficult conversations about your own performance or decisions? I also learned the importance of layers in information management. Different people should have access to different levels of detail about your thinking and planning. Your closest allies might know your overall strategic direction. Your working colleagues might know your immediate tactical plans, and your competitors might know only what you want them to know about your capabilities and intentions. But perhaps most importantly, you must never lie about your fundamental character or capabilities. People need to understand what kind of person they're dealing with, even if they don't understand all your specific plans. The deception that ultimately destroys leaders is the kind that makes people fundamentally misunderstand what to expect from you. Your reputation should be built on reliability in areas where others need to predict your behavior, your standards, your responses to cooperation and opposition, your competence in your area of expertise. But you should maintain strategic ambiguity in areas where predictability would compromise your effectiveness, your specific plans, your assessment of other people, your response to hypothetical future scenarios. The goal is not to be mysterious for its own sake, but to ensure that you can act effectively on behalf of your legitimate interests without being constrained by others' ability to anticipate and counter your every move. One of the most crucial insights I developed during my years of political observation concerns the relationship between human agency and external circumstances, what I came to call the eternal struggle between virtù and fortuna. Most people who fail in competitive environments do so not because they lack ability or ambition, but because they cannot adapt their approach when circumstances change in ways they did not anticipate. I learned this lesson most painfully through my own experience. For years, I had operated successfully within the Republican system of Florence, building influence through careful alliance building, competent administration, and loyalty to Republican principles. This approach served me well, while those principles remained dominant in Florentine politics. But when the external situation changed, when foreign military pressure and internal dissatisfaction created conditions favorable to the Medici restoration, I continued using methods that had become not just ineffective, but dangerous. My mistake was treating my successful approach as universally applicable rather than recognizing it as effective only under specific conditions. When those conditions changed, I should have changed with them. Instead, I remained committed to strategies that had worked in the past but were inappropriate for the new reality. This taught me that fortune, the external circumstances beyond our immediate control, is neither purely random nor completely predictable. It follows patterns that can be studied and anticipated, but it also contains elements of genuine uncertainty that no amount of planning can eliminate. The key to dealing with fortune is developing adaptive capacity rather than trying to eliminate uncertainty. I observed that the most successful leaders shared a common characteristic. They maintained multiple potential strategies simultaneously and could shift between them quickly when circumstances demanded. They didn't commit themselves so completely to any single approach that they couldn't change direction when external conditions shifted. Cesare Borgia demonstrated this adaptive capacity throughout his career. When he had strong papal backing, he operated as a legitimate ruler, building institutional authority. When his father's death weakened his position, he immediately shifted to more desperate measures, attempting to maintain power through direct military force and strategic alliances. When even these approaches failed, he tried to negotiate favorable terms for surrender rather than fighting hopeless battles. While his ultimate failure demonstrated the limits of adaptation, some circumstances cannot be overcome regardless of how quickly you adapt. His willingness to change strategies as conditions changed allowed him to maintain power far longer than leaders who remained committed to approaches that were no longer viable. The principle I extracted from these observations was that effective leaders must be both consistent in their core objectives and flexible in their methods. Your fundamental goals, what you want to achieve and why, should remain stable even when your tactics must change dramatically. But your specific strategies and alliances should be constantly evaluated and modified based on changing circumstances. This requires developing what I came to think of as strategic detachment, the ability to evaluate your own methods objectively, rather than becoming emotionally invested in particular approaches. Most people become attached to strategies that have served them well in the past, even when those strategies are no longer appropriate for current conditions. I watched many leaders destroy themselves by persisting with outdated approaches because abandoning them felt like admitting failure or betraying their principles. But there is no virtue in consistency that leads to ineffectiveness. The truly principled approach is to remain committed to your ultimate objectives while being willing to change whatever methods are necessary to achieve them. Fortune also teaches us about the importance of timing in a different way than I discussed earlier. While strategic timing involves choosing when to act, adaptive timing involves recognizing when to change your entire approach. These moments of necessary transformation often feel premature. You may still be achieving some success with your current methods, but the underlying conditions that made them effective are shifting. The leaders who successfully navigate these transitions are those who can see trends before they become obvious to everyone else. They recognize that their current success may be masking the erosion of the foundations that made that success possible. They change their approach while they still have the resources and position to implement new strategies effectively. This requires constant environmental scanning, paying attention not just to your immediate competitive situation, but to the larger forces that shape the context within which you operate. Political changes, economic shifts, technological developments, cultural trends, all of these can alter the rules of success in ways that make previously effective strategies counterproductive. The key is maintaining what I call strategic humility, recognizing that your past successes were partly due to favorable circumstances, not just your personal abilities. This humility makes it easier to adapt when circumstances change, because you don't have to preserve your ego by insisting that methods that worked before will work again. Fortune cannot be controlled, but it can be prepared for through diversification of capabilities, flexibility of approach, and constant readiness to implement alternative strategies when conditions demand them. The most persistent error I observe in ambitious people is their belief that power can be accumulated through purely noble means. They imagine that if they simply work harder, perform better, and maintain higher ethical standards than their competitors, recognition and advancement will naturally follow. This idealistic view of how power operates has destroyed more promising careers than any external opposition ever could. Power, I learned through careful observation, is not a reward for virtue. It is a tool that enables virtue to be effective in the world. The person who refuses to seek power because the process seems distasteful is often condemning themselves to irrelevance, while ensuring that power falls to those less scrupulous about how they use it. During my years in government, I watched genuinely capable and well-intentioned people consistently lose influence to those who understood the practical mechanics of accumulating authority. The good people focused on doing excellent work and assumed their contributions would be recognized. The successful people focused on ensuring their excellent work was recognized, credited properly, and positioned to lead to greater responsibilities. This taught me that power accumulation requires systematic attention to several elements that many people find uncomfortable to think about strategically. First, you must build networks of obligation and reciprocal benefit with people who can advance your interests. This doesn't mean manipulation or exploitation. It means understanding that sustainable influence depends on your ability to help others achieve their legitimate goals. I observed that the most effective power builders created what I came to think of as value loops, situations where helping them succeed also helped others succeed. They didn't just ask for favors. They created ongoing relationships where their advancement served multiple people's interests simultaneously. This made their success feel inevitable rather than competitive. Second, you must control the narrative about your contributions and capabilities. Excellent work that goes unnoticed or uncredited might as well not have been done from a career advancement perspective. This requires what many good people find distasteful: strategic self-promotion and careful management of how your achievements are perceived and remembered. But there is a crucial difference between effective self-promotion and counterproductive ego display. Effective self-promotion focuses on the value you create for others and the problems you solve for the organization. It emphasizes results and capabilities rather than demanding recognition for its own sake. People should understand what you can do and what you have accomplished, but they should also see how this benefits them, rather than just serving your ambition. Third, you must gradually escalate your willingness to use increasingly sophisticated tactics as the stakes of competition increase. Early in your career, simple competence and reliability might be sufficient to advance. But as you move into positions with greater responsibility and competition, you will need to employ more strategic thinking about positioning, timing, and coalition building. This escalation should be gradual and appropriate to the level of competition you face. You don't need to employ advanced Machiavellian tactics to win a junior promotion, but you will need them to compete for senior leadership positions, where the stakes are higher and the competition more sophisticated. I learned this principle by studying how the Medici family regained power in Florence. They didn't begin with dramatic political maneuvers. They started by rebuilding their economic influence, rekindling old relationships, and positioning themselves as a solution to existing problems. Only when they had rebuilt a foundation of support did they move to more direct political action. Fourth, you must develop the ability to form strategic alliances without becoming dependent on any single relationship or patron. Power that depends entirely on one person's continued favor is extremely vulnerable, as I learned through my own experience when the Republican government fell. The most secure power is distributed power, influence that comes from multiple sources, and serves multiple constituencies. This requires building relationships across different factions and interest groups, even when some of these relationships involve people you don't personally like or whose methods you don't entirely approve. But perhaps most importantly, you must maintain clarity about why you seek power and what you intend to do with it. Power pursued for its own sake often becomes self-defeating because it leads to decisions that preserve your position in the short term while undermining your long-term effectiveness and credibility. The most successful power builders I observed were those who had genuine commitments to goals larger than their personal advancement. Their desire for influence was instrumental rather than purely personal. They wanted power because they had things they wanted to accomplish that required power to achieve. This larger purpose served two crucial functions. It made their ambition appear legitimate to others who might support them, and it provided them with criteria for making decisions when the immediate path to greater power conflicted with their longer-term objectives. Remember that power is ultimately about your ability to make things happen in the world. The person who accumulates influence but uses it ineffectively will not retain it for long. The person who builds power systematically and uses it competently will find that success creates momentum for continued advancement. Nothing in my political education was more painful or more instructive than learning to recognize, respond to, and recover from betrayal. The naive assumption that people who benefit from your success will naturally remain loyal to you has destroyed more leaders than any external enemy ever could. Betrayal is not an aberration in competitive environments. It is a predictable pattern that wise leaders prepare for systematically. My first serious encounter with betrayal came during the factional struggles within the Florentine government. I had worked closely with several colleagues to develop policies that strengthened our republic's position against external threats. When political winds shifted and supporting these policies became potentially costly, I discovered that people who had enthusiastically endorsed my work in private were suddenly unable to remember their involvement when questioned publicly. This taught me the fundamental lesson about fair-weather loyalty. People who support you only when it serves their interests will abandon you the moment that calculation changes. The error most leaders make is treating conditional support as if it were unconditional commitment, then feeling personally wounded when reality corrects their misunderstanding. But betrayal often comes from closer quarters, from people who have genuinely benefited from your trust and support. During my diplomatic career, I shared sensitive information with a colleague who I believed had similar interests in strengthening Florence's negotiating position. When he saw an opportunity to advance his own standing by revealing my confidences to our opponents, he didn't hesitate to sacrifice our relationship for his immediate advantage. The pain of such betrayals is real, but dwelling on the emotional dimension prevents you from learning the tactical lessons they offer. The most important insight is that people's loyalty is almost always situational rather than personal. They remain loyal as long as doing so serves their larger interests, but they will adapt their allegiances when circumstances change. This doesn't make them evil. It makes them human. The mistake is yours if you build strategies that depend on unchanging loyalty from people whose interests might evolve in directions that conflict with yours. Better to assume that all alliances are temporary and all commitments are conditional. Then be pleasantly surprised when some prove more durable than expected. Recognizing betrayal before it destroys you requires developing systems for testing loyalty and monitoring the interests of people in your coalition. I learned to create situations where the cost of remaining loyal was modest but real. Then observe who chose to bear that cost and who found reasons to avoid it. These small tests revealed character more clearly than grand gestures or public declarations. I also learned to pay attention to changes in people's circumstances that might make their continued alliance with me less attractive. When someone's position, resources, or opportunities shifted in ways that changed their strategic calculations, I assumed their loyalty might shift as well, regardless of their past commitments or current assurances. When betrayal occurs, the immediate temptation is to respond with emotional intensity, to punish the betrayer, to warn others about their unreliability, to demand accountability for their broken commitments. But emotional responses to betrayal usually serve the betrayer's interests more than yours, because they make you appear vindictive and unstable. The more effective response is strategic rather than emotional. First, assess what the betrayal actually cost you beyond your wounded feelings. Sometimes the practical damage is less severe than the psychological impact, and focusing on the practical dimension helps you choose proportionate responses. Second, consider what the betrayal reveals about your own strategic errors. Did you trust too much, too early? Did you fail to align the betrayer's interests with yours adequately? Did you miss warning signs that others might have noticed? Learning from betrayal is more valuable than punishing it. Third, decide whether the betrayer might still be useful to you in some limited capacity. Sometimes people who cannot be trusted with sensitive information can still be valuable for other purposes. The key is ensuring that any future relationship operates within constraints that prevent them from betraying you again. But when betrayal threatens substantial damage to your position or reputation, decisive response becomes necessary. The response should be swift enough to demonstrate that betraying you has consequences, and complete enough to prevent the betrayer from causing further damage. Most importantly, it should appear to be a natural consequence of their actions rather than personal vindictiveness on your part. I learned this principle by observing how Cesare Borgia handled treachery among his subordinates. When betrayal was minor, he often ignored it entirely, understanding that punishing every small disloyalty would consume excessive energy and create an atmosphere of paranoia. But when betrayal threatened his core interests, his response was so swift and complete that it served as education for others who might consider similar actions. The goal is not to prevent all future betrayals. That's impossible in any competitive environment. The goal is to ensure that people understand the cost-benefit analysis clearly, Betraying you should appear more risky and less rewarding than remaining in your coalition. This requires that your responses to treachery be both predictable in their swiftness and proportionate to the damage attempted. The question that tormented me most during my exile was not whether my political philosophy was effective. Events had proven that it was, but whether it was moral. Could a person employ the tactics I advocated and still consider themselves ethical? This question forced me to develop a framework for thinking about morality that most people find deeply uncomfortable, but which I believe is essential for anyone who seeks to achieve meaningful results in competitive environments. Traditional morality, I came to understand, assumes a world where virtue is always rewarded and evil is always punished. It assumes that if you follow established moral rules consistently, you will achieve good outcomes both for yourself and for those you serve. This assumption works reasonably well in stable, predictable environments where everyone follows similar rules and where authorities exist to enforce fair play. But in truly competitive situations, whether in Renaissance Italian politics or modern organizational environments, these assumptions break down. When your opponents are willing to use methods that you consider unethical, maintaining strict adherence to traditional moral codes often means accepting defeat and allowing less scrupulous people to control outcomes that affect many others. This creates what I came to think of as the moral paradox of leadership. Sometimes the most ethical choice is to employ methods that appear unethical in order to prevent outcomes that would be genuinely harmful to people you have responsibility to protect. During my government service, I faced situations where completus honesty would have compromised Florence's negotiating position and potentially led to military conflicts that would cost lives and resources. Was it more moral to tell the truth and accept the destructive consequences, or to use strategic deception to protect my city's interests? Traditional ethics provided no useful guidance for such decisions. I concluded that leaders must operate under a different moral framework than private individuals. Private morality can afford to be absolute because private individuals are primarily responsible for their own souls and their immediate relationships. But leaders bear responsibility for outcomes that affect many people, and this responsibility creates obligations that sometimes conflict with traditional moral rules. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics entirely. It means recognizing that leadership ethics must be consequentialist rather than purely rule-based. The moral test for a leader's actions should not be whether they conform to abstract principles, but whether they serve the legitimate interests of those the leader is responsible for protecting. But this framework requires extraordinary honesty about your motivations and the actual consequences of your choices. It is extremely easy to rationalize selfish or destructive behavior by claiming it serves larger purposes. The difference between necessary ruthlessness and self-serving cruelty often lies not in the actions themselves, but in the genuine intentions behind them. I developed several tests that I applied to my own difficult decisions. First, am I choosing this course of action primarily to serve interests larger than my personal comfort and advancement? If the primary beneficiary of my choice is my own convenience or ego, then I am probably rationalizing rather than reasoning ethically. Second, have I seriously considered alternatives that might achieve the same objectives through less controversial means? If I have not genuinely explored other options, then I may be choosing harsh methods out of laziness or preference rather than necessity. Third, am I prepared to accept personal responsibility for the consequences of my actions, including consequences that I did not intend but should have anticipated? Ethical leadership requires owning the full results of your choices, not just the ones that serve your purposes. Fourth, would I be comfortable if others knew my complete reasoning for this decision, even if I cannot share that reasoning publicly at the time? If I would be ashamed to have my thought process examined by people whose judgment I respect, then I am probably compromising my principles rather than adapting them to difficult circumstances. The most important insight I reached was that moral purity is often a luxury that leaders cannot afford without failing in their larger responsibilities. The person who refuses to make difficult decisions because they appear ethically problematic may be preserving their personal sense of virtue while allowing genuinely harmful outcomes to occur through their inaction. But there is a crucial difference between accepting moral complexity and abandoning moral reasoning entirely. The leader who employs harsh methods must constantly examine whether those methods remain necessary and proportionate to the threats they address. Power tends to make harsh methods feel normal and justified, even when they are no longer serving legitimate purposes. This requires building relationships with people who can challenge your reasoning and hold you accountable for maintaining ethical standards, even while adapting your methods to competitive realities. You need advisors who understand both the pressures you face and the principles you claim to serve, who can help you distinguish between necessary adaptation and self-serving rationalization. The goal is not to become a person who feels comfortable with cruelty, but to become a person who can bear the psychological cost of necessary harshness in service of outcomes that justify that cost. This is perhaps the heaviest burden of effective leadership, accepting responsibility for difficult choices, so that others don't have to live with the consequences of avoiding them. One of the most crucial principles I learned through observing successful and failed leaders is that power without territory is temporary, but territory without the will to defend it is illusory. By territory, I don't mean only physical space, though that was certainly important in Renaissance Italy, but sphere of influence, areas of responsibility, relationships of dependency, and control over resources that others need or want. Most people who achieve initial success fail to consolidate it because they don't understand the difference between winning a position and securing that position for the long term. They focus so intensely on reaching their immediate goals that they neglect the systematic work required to make their achievements sustainable against future challenges. During my diplomatic career, I observed this pattern repeatedly. A faction would gain control of a city-state through superior strategy or favorable circumstances, then immediately begin fighting among themselves about how to distribute the benefits of victory. While they argued about rewards, their displaced enemies were regrouping, building new alliances, and preparing counter-moves. Within a few years, many of these victorious factions found themselves overthrown by the very people they had defeated, because they had never properly secured their initial conquest. The first principle of territorial consolidation is establishing clear boundaries and making the cost of crossing them predictable and substantial. This means defining your areas of authority and responsibility precisely, then demonstrating that you will defend them consistently. People need to understand exactly what you control, what level of interference you will tolerate, and what happens when those boundaries are violated. But boundaries mean nothing without the capability and will to enforce them. I learned this by studying the difference between successful and unsuccessful attempts at territorial expansion during the Italian Wars. Leaders who could clearly articulate their boundaries but lacked the resources to defend them often found those boundaries tested constantly. Leaders who had the resources but were inconsistent in their enforcement found themselves facing escalating challenges as people tested their resolve. The most secure territory is that which others depend on for their own success. Rather than simply controlling resources or relationships, the skilled operator creates situations where disrupting their authority would harm many other people's interests. This transforms potential opponents into invested stakeholders who have reasons to support your continued success. I observed this principle in operation when studying the Medici banking empire. Lorenzo de' Medici didn't maintain power simply through wealth or political connections, though he had both. He maintained power by ensuring that his family's financial institutions were essential to the prosperity of numerous other families throughout Italy. Challenging Medici authority meant risking economic disruption that would hurt many people beyond the Medici themselves. In modern terms, this means building your position so that your success creates opportunities for others. Your expertise becomes valuable to multiple constituencies, and your removal would create problems that extend beyond your personal disappointment. You want to be not just competent, but integral, someone whose absence would require significant adjustment by many other people. The second crucial element of territorial maintenance is constant environmental scanning to identify emerging threats before they become serious challenges. Most territorial losses occur not through direct assault, but through gradual erosion that goes unnoticed until it becomes irreversible. This requires developing information networks that help you understand how others perceive your position, what alternative arrangements they might be considering, and what changes in the larger environment might create opportunities for challenges to your authority. You need to know not just what is happening now, but what trends are developing that might change the dynamics of your competitive situation. I learned this lesson through my own failure to anticipate the Medici restoration. The signs were visible. Months before the actual political change, shifts in papal politics, changes in military alliances, growing dissatisfaction with Republican policies among certain constituencies. But I was too focused on immediate administrative responsibilities to pay adequate attention to these larger trends. Territory also requires periodic demonstration of your continued capability and resolve. Even well-established authority will be tested if people begin to wonder whether you still possess the abilities and determination that originally secured your position. These demonstrations don't need to be dramatic, but they need to be visible enough to remind potential challengers that your power remains real and active. The timing of such demonstrations is crucial. They should occur when you can choose the circumstances and ensure favorable outcomes, not in response to actual challenges when your position might already be weakened. The goal is to prevent serious challenges by maintaining the perception that challenging you would be costly and unlikely to succeed. But perhaps most importantly, territorial maintenance requires understanding when to expand and when to consolidate. The temptation after achieving success is often to pursue additional opportunities aggressively, but expansion that overextends your resources or creates too many new enemies can destroy established positions. I watched several Italian leaders make this error, achieving control over one region, then immediately launching campaigns to conquer adjacent territories before they had fully secured their original conquest. The additional campaigns drained resources that should have been used for consolidation, while creating new enemies who could alliance with displaced elements from the original territory. The wise strategy is often to pause after achieving significant success, focus on making that success sustainable, and only pursue additional opportunities when your current position is genuinely secure and you have resources available that won't compromise your existing achievements. The fundamental principles of power that I observed in Renaissance Italy remain as relevant today as they were 5 centuries ago, but the specific tactics and tools have evolved dramatically. The leader who wishes to employ strategic ruthlessness in modern environments must understand how timeless principles translate into contemporary methods while navigating the constraints and opportunities created by current technology, legal frameworks, and cultural expectations. The most significant change from my era to yours is the speed and scope of information flow. In my time, controlling what people knew about your activities was relatively straightforward. Information traveled slowly, and most people had access only to what they could observe directly or learn through limited networks of personal contacts. Today, information moves instantly across global networks, and people have unprecedented access to data about your actions, statements, and associations. This creates both vulnerabilities and opportunities for the strategic operator. The vulnerability is obvious. Actions that might have remained private in my era can now become public knowledge with devastating speed. A single careless communication, an unguarded moment caught on recording, or a former ally's decision to share confidential information can destroy reputations and positions almost instantly. But the opportunity is equally significant. You now have access to information about competitors, market conditions, and strategic developments that would have been impossible to obtain in previous eras. The same technologies that create transparency can be used to gather intelligence, build networks, and influence outcomes in ways that I could never have imagined. The modern equivalent of my advice about controlling information flow involves understanding digital presence and strategic communication. Every email, social media post, and recorded statement becomes part of a permanent record that can be analyzed, shared, and used to support or undermine your position. This requires much more careful attention to consistency between your private communications and public positions. But it also means that competitors who are careless about their own communications provide you with opportunities to understand their strategies, identify their weaknesses, and anticipate their moves in ways that give you substantial advantages. The person who learns to gather and analyze this freely available information while protecting their own strategic thinking gains the modern equivalent of the intelligence advantages that Renaissance leaders achieved through spy networks. Economic warfare has also evolved in sophisticated ways. Rather than the direct military conflicts that characterized my era, modern competitive environments feature battles over market position, resource access, regulatory influence, and technological advantage. The principles of strategic timing, alliance building, and opponent neutralization apply directly to these modern forms of conflict. The equivalent of eliminating rivals today might involve exposing their incompetence through carefully documented performance comparisons, undermining their credibility by highlighting inconsistencies in their positions, or neutralizing their influence by building alternative coalitions that make their support unnecessary. But modern environments also provide more subtle tools for competitive advantage. Understanding regulatory frameworks, tax implications, legal precedents, and bureaucratic procedures can create opportunities to achieve objectives through official channels while making opposition appear unreasonable or illegitimate. The modern prince must also understand the role of media and public perception in ways that my era never required. Public opinion, shaped by traditional media, social media, and direct communication technologies, can influence outcomes more directly than ever before. This means that managing perception becomes as important as managing reality in many competitive situations, but this creates both opportunities and constraints. The opportunity is that skilled operators can influence perceptions directly rather than relying on intermediaries to communicate their positions. The constraint is that any attempt to manage perception can itself become visible and potentially damaging if it appears manipulative or deceptive. The key is developing authentic expertise and genuine value, while also ensuring that this expertise and value are recognized and credited properly. The modern equivalent of building fear and respect involves demonstrating competence so clearly that opposition appears unreasonable, and building alliances so effectively that challenging you requires confronting multiple constituencies simultaneously. Technology also creates new forms of dependency and leverage. In my era, power often flowed from control over physical resources or geographic positions. Today, it can flow from access to information, technological capabilities, network effects, or regulatory relationships. Understanding these modern sources of leverage and building positions that control or influence them becomes crucial for sustainable competitive advantage. But perhaps most importantly, modern environments require much more sophisticated understanding of legal and ethical boundaries. The ruthless methods that I observed and advocated must be adapted to operate within contemporary legal frameworks and professional standards. This doesn't mean abandoning strategic thinking, but it does mean being much more careful about which specific tactics are viable and sustainable. The modern Machiavellian succeeds not by ignoring these constraints, but by understanding them so thoroughly that they can achieve their objectives while remaining within acceptable boundaries. They find ways to be strategically ruthless that appear not only legal, but professionally appropriate and ethically justifiable. They understand how to be maximally effective within the constraints of their environment rather than pretending those constraints don't exist. Perhaps the most dangerous moment in any leader's development comes when they begin to succeed through strategic ruthlessness, because success with these methods can create a psychological transformation that ultimately destroys the very capabilities that made the success possible. I learned this by observing leaders who mastered the principles I advocated but then fell victim to their own power. The first warning sign is when strategic ruthlessness begins to feel natural rather than necessary. When I first developed my understanding of power politics, every harsh decision required careful thought and emotional effort. I had to overcome my natural inclinations toward cooperation and fairness in order to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. This internal resistance served as a useful check. It ensured that I employed severe methods only when they were genuinely necessary for larger purposes. But I watched other leaders lose this internal resistance over time. They became so comfortable with manipulation, deception, and elimination of opponents that these methods became their default approaches to any problem. What had begun as strategic adaptation to competitive realities became an ingrained pattern of behavior that they applied even in situations where cooperation would have been more effective. This transformation is particularly dangerous because it often occurs gradually and is masked by continued success in the short term. The leader who has learned to neutralize opposition effectively may continue to use these methods, even when building alliances would serve their interests better. They may continue to employ deception, even when honesty would create stronger relationships. They may continue to eliminate potential rivals, even when converting them into allies would strengthen their position. I observed this pattern in Cesare Borgia during the final phase of his career. Having achieved remarkable success through systematic elimination of enemies and strategic deception, he seemed unable to recognize when circumstances called for different approaches. When his father's death weakened his position and he desperately needed allies, his reputation for treachery made it impossible for potential supporters to trust him. The very methods that had built his power prevented him from adapting to changed circumstances that required collaborative strategies. The second danger is the gradual erosion of judgment about proportionality. Effective strategic ruthlessness requires precise calibration, using exactly as much force as necessary to achieve your objectives, but no more. This calibration depends on maintaining emotional distance from your own power and clear thinking about the relationship between means and ends. But success with harsh methods can create psychological changes that interfere with this judgment. Leaders begin to enjoy the sense of control that comes from being feared. They start to interpret any resistance or disagreement as a threat requiring elimination. They lose the ability to distinguish between necessary elimination of genuine threats and unnecessary destruction of minor irritants. This leads to what I came to think of as strategic overreach, employing advanced Machiavellian tactics in situations where simple direct communication would be more effective. The leader who has learned to outmaneuver opponents may continue trying to outmaneuver people even when straightforward cooperation would better serve everyone's interests. The third warning sign is isolation from advisors who can provide honest feedback about your methods and their effects. Strategic ruthlessness often requires actions that damage relationships and leaders who employ these methods effectively may find that fewer people are willing to offer candid advice about their decisions. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. As your methods become more sophisticated and potentially controversial, you receive less honest input about whether those methods remain necessary and proportionate. You may continue escalating your approaches because you lack access to perspectives that would help you recognize when you have gone too far. I learned this lesson through my own experience during the final years of the Florentine Republic. My reputation for political sophistication meant that colleagues were often reluctant to challenge my strategic thinking directly, even when my approaches were becoming counterproductive. I mistook their deference for agreement and continued pursuing strategies that were alienating potential allies. The most effective safeguard against these dangers is maintaining relationships with people who knew you before you developed sophisticated power skills, people who can remind you of your original purposes and call attention to changes in your character that you might not notice yourself. You also need regular opportunities to employ non-ruthless methods successfully, to remind yourself that cooperation, honesty, and trust-building remain viable approaches in many situations. If your only tool becomes strategic ruthlessness, you will tend to see every problem as requiring that solution, even when simpler and less controversial methods would be more effective. Perhaps most importantly, you must regularly examine whether your methods are still serving purposes larger than your personal comfort and advancement. The moment strategic ruthlessness begins serving primarily to protect your ego or avoid difficult conversations rather than to achieve important objectives, it has become counterproductive regardless of its short-term effectiveness. The goal is to remain someone who can employ harsh methods when necessary, while retaining the ability to build genuine relationships, inspire voluntary cooperation, and create value for others. The leader who loses these capabilities in pursuit of strategic advantage has traded long-term effectiveness for short-term control. Now comes the moment of truth, the point where philosophical understanding must transform into practical action. Throughout my exile, as I developed these principles through study and reflection, I constantly tested them against a crucial question. How would I apply this knowledge if I were given another opportunity to compete for meaningful stakes? The insights I have shared with you emerged from this process of imagining how strategic ruthlessness could be implemented systematically in real competitive situations. Your first step must be honest assessment of your current competitive position. Most people who feel frustrated by their lack of advancement have never clearly identified what they're actually competing for, who they are competing against, and what advantages their competitors currently possess. Without this clarity, strategic thinking becomes impossible because you cannot design effective approaches to undefined problems. Begin by identifying your specific objectives in concrete, measurable terms. Rather than vague desires for success or recognition, define exactly what positions, resources, or relationships you want to acquire. What would your ideal situation look like in 6 months, 2 years, and 5 years? What specific changes in your circumstances would indicate that your strategic efforts were succeeding? Next, systematically identify the people who currently control access to these objectives or who are competing for the same opportunities. Who makes the decisions that affect your advancement? Who influences those decision makers? Who else wants what you want, and what advantages do they currently possess that you lack? This analysis must be ruthlessly honest. Wishful thinking about your competitive position will only lead to ineffective strategies. Once you understand your competitive landscape clearly, you can begin applying the principles I have outlined. Start with the fundamentals, building genuine expertise that creates value for others, establishing a reputation for reliability and competence, and developing relationships based on reciprocal benefit rather than one-sided dependency. But as you build this foundation, also begin implementing more sophisticated approaches. Practice the lion and fox principle by developing both direct and indirect methods for advancing your interests. Learn to read the timing of opportunities and threats. Begin gathering intelligence about your competitors' strengths, weaknesses, and strategic intentions. Most importantly, start small and build gradually. The person who attempts to implement advanced Machiavellian tactics without first mastering the basics will likely create more problems than they solve. Begin by applying strategic thinking to relatively low-stakes situations where mistakes won't be catastrophic. Then gradually expand your sophistication as you gain experience and confidence. Pay particular attention to developing your ability to control information strategically. Practice being selectively transparent, sharing information that serves your purposes while protecting information that could be used against you. Learn to read other people's motivations and interests accurately so you can predict their behavior and design approaches that align their success with yours. As you begin to see results from these methods, resist the temptation to accelerate too quickly or to employ harsh tactics when gentler ones would be sufficient. Remember that the goal is sustainable competitive advantage, not immediate domination. Build your reputation as someone who is both capable and reasonable, someone who rewards cooperation but responds decisively to opposition, but also prepares yourself psychologically for the changes that strategic success will require. You will need to become comfortable with being misunderstood by people who prefer to avoid competitive realities. You will need to accept responsibility for difficult decisions that serve larger purposes but create immediate discomfort. You will need to maintain relationships with people whose loyalty you cannot entirely trust. This transformation requires what I came to think of as strategic maturity, the ability to hold complex, sometimes contradictory ideas simultaneously. You must be genuinely committed to creating value for others while being strategically focused on advancing your own interests. You must be capable of both cooperation and competition, often with the same people in different contexts. The process will change you, and you must be prepared for that change while working to ensure it enhances rather than corrupts your character. The goal is to become more effective at achieving worthy objectives, not to become a person who enjoys manipulating others for its own sake. Remember that these principles exist to serve your larger purposes, not to become purposes in themselves. Strategic ruthlessness should make you more capable of achieving things that matter to you, not transform you into someone whose only satisfaction comes from exercising power over others. Throughout this process, maintain connections with people and activities that remind you of your original values and motivations. The person who loses sight of why they sought power in the first place often finds that achieving it brings less satisfaction than they expected. Your personal renaissance begins the moment you accept responsibility for your competitive situation and commit to changing it through systematic application of strategic principles. Like my own rebirth of understanding during exile, this transformation requires both intellectual honesty about how power actually works and emotional courage to act on that understanding, even when it feels uncomfortable. As I conclude these reflections on the nature of strategic power, I find myself thinking not about the immediate applications you might make of these principles, but about the longer legacy of choosing effectiveness over comfort, results over purity, strategic thinking over wishful thinking about how the world should operate. The choice to embrace necessary ruthlessness is not simply a career decision. It is a philosophical choice about what kind of person you will become and what kind of world you will help create. When good people refuse to think strategically about power, they abandon the field to those who have no such scruples. When capable people choose moral purity over practical effectiveness, they ensure that important decisions will be made by those less qualified and less principled. History will not remember most of us as individuals, but it will be shaped by the collective choices we make about whether to engage seriously with competitive realities or to retreat into comfortable illusions about how merit and virtue are rewarded. Every time someone with genuine abilities chooses to avoid the strategic thinking required for advancement, they create opportunities for less scrupulous competitors to gain influence over outcomes that affect many others. This is why I have never apologized for developing and teaching these principles despite the centuries of criticism they have generated. The alternative to strategic ruthlessness is not universal cooperation and fairness. It is dominance by those who understand power but use it without the constraints of larger purposes or ethical considerations. The leader who masters these principles, while retaining commitment to worthy objectives, becomes a force for good in the world, not despite their strategic sophistication, but because of it. They create organizations that function effectively, relationships that serve multiple parties' interests, and outcomes that benefit people beyond themselves. But the leader who refuses to develop strategic capabilities, who insists on operating according to rules that their competitors ignore, often finds themselves unable to protect even their own principles when circumstances become difficult. Their moral purity becomes a luxury that they can afford only when others are willing to make the hard choices necessary to maintain the conditions that allow such purity to exist. I have spent my exile years not only developing these ideas, but imagining the kind of person who would apply them well, someone who could be both strategically ruthless and genuinely committed to serving interests larger than their personal advancement. This ideal leader would employ harsh methods when necessary, but would never lose sight of the purposes those methods were meant to serve. They would build power systematically, but would use that power to create value for others and to achieve objectives that justified the costs of pursuing them. They would be feared by those who threatened important interests, but loved by those who benefited from effective leadership. They would make difficult decisions that others could not or would not make, then accept responsibility for the consequences without self-pity or self-justification. Most importantly, they would understand that these capabilities come with obligations to use power wisely, to remain connected to the human costs of strategic decisions, and to ensure that their methods serve purposes that transcend their personal comfort and advancement. The world needs such leaders more than it needs additional people who understand what should be done but lack the strategic sophistication to make it happen. The world needs people who can bridge the gap between idealistic vision and practical achievement, who can translate worthy objectives into effective action, even when that action requires difficult choices. Whether you become such a person depends not only on your willingness to learn these principles, but on your ability to apply them while retaining the qualities that made them worth developing in the first place. The true test of strategic ruthlessness is not whether it helps you gain power, but whether it helps you use whatever power you gain to create outcomes that justify the methods required to achieve them. My final counsel to you is this: embrace these principles not because they will make you comfortable, but because they will make you capable. The comfort will come later, from the satisfaction of achieving things that matter through the systematic application of strategic intelligence to competitive realities. The world is waiting for leaders who understand both what should be done and how to make it happen. Carry forward what I have taught you and prove that strategic ruthlessness, properly applied, serves not just personal advancement, but the larger cause of human flourishing under the guidance of those wise enough to lead and strong enough to make their leadership effective.